My name is Elena Vasquez. I am 36 years old, and for the past 4 years, I have allowed the most powerful media family in France to believe they had completely destroyed me. I want you to picture the courtroom on the morning of March 14th. The Palais de Justice in Paris is not a building that forgives weakness. Its stone walls have absorbed centuries of verdicts, confessions, and the particular silence that falls over a room when someone's entire life is about to be decided by a stranger in a black robe. The chandeliers overhead threw cold, indifferent light across the polished floor. The smell was what I remember most clearly: wood polish and old paper and the faint metallic edge of institutional air conditioning. The smell of a place where outcomes are final. I sat at the respondent's table in a plain charcoal blazer and dark trousers, my dark hair pulled back simply, my hands folded on the surface in front of me. No jewelry except my daughter's birthstone ring on my right hand, a small oval of pale blue aquamarine that Sophie had given me for my birthday 3 years ago, back when she still gave me birthday presents freely, before her father's family had begun the slow, deliberate work of teaching her that her mother was a person to be pitied. Sophie was 9 years old. She was sitting in the anteroom down the hall with a court-appointed child advocate named Madame Lefebvre, a small, brisk woman with reading glasses on a beaded chain who had told me before the proceedings began that she took her job very seriously and that she did not tolerate the weaponization of children in family court disputes. She had said this while looking at both me and the opposing table with equal weight, which I respected, the opposing table. I let my gaze travel there slowly and deliberately, the way you observe a fire with full attention and complete composure, because panic in the presence of fire costs you the seconds you need to think clearly. Etienne Beaumont sat at the plaintiff's table in a suit that had been cut in London and cost more than most Parisians earned in 3 months. He was 41, still technically handsome, in the way of men who have always been told they are handsome and have arranged their faces accordingly. The jaw held at a particular angle, the posture calibrated for maximum impression. We had been married for 6 years and divorced for 4, and in those 4 years, he had grown into his family's image of him with the completeness of a man who had finally stopped pretending to be different from what he was. Beside him sat his mother, Vivienne Beaumont, 63 years old, chairwoman of Groupe Beaumont, the media conglomerate that controlled 3 major French television networks, 11 magazine titles, 2 national newspapers, and a digital streaming platform with 40 million subscribers across Europe. She was wearing pale gray Chanel, and her silver hair was immaculate, and she looked at me from across the courtroom with the flat, evaluating expression of someone calculating the cost of a nuisance. On Etienne's other side sat his sister Margot, 38, who served as Groupe Beaumont's chief communications officer and who had spent the past 4 years ensuring that whenever my name appeared in the French media landscape, which was controlled substantially by her family's empire, it appeared in connection with words like unstable, erratic, and struggling. Margot was very good at her job. The Beaumont family's lead attorney, a man named Maître Renard, was already on his feet before Judge Colombe had fully settled into her chair. Maître Renard was the kind of lawyer who wore his confidence like a second suit, effortless, expensive, and designed to make everyone else in the room feel underdressed. He had represented the Beaumont family in legal matters for 20 years. He had never lost a case involving them. He had told Etienne apparently that this proceeding would be resolved before lunch. "Your Honor," Maître Renard began, his voice carrying the particular music of a man who has addressed courts so many times that the performance has become indistinguishable from ease. "We are here today on an emergency application for modification of existing custody arrangements regarding the minor child Sophie Beaumont, age 9. My clients seek full residential custody of Sophie with visiting rights for the respondent to be determined at the court's discretion." He paused, letting the words settle. "The grounds for this application are straightforward and extensively documented. The respondent, Elena Vasquez, is financially destitute. She has no stable residence, no verifiable income, and no professional prospects. She has been moving between short-term furnished rentals in the outer arrondissements for the past 18 months. She currently owes substantial sums to 3 creditors. She has been observed on multiple occasions, documented by an investigative firm retained by my clients, leaving Sophie in the unsupervised care of neighbors while she pursues what she describes as freelance catering work for which she has produced no contracts, no client references, and no tax declarations for the preceding 2 fiscal years." He turned slightly, gesturing toward his clients with the practiced grace of a conductor acknowledging his orchestra. "My clients, by contrast, offer Sophie a permanent home in one of Paris's finest residential addresses. They offer her access to the finest private education in France. They offer her stability, continuity, and the full resources of one of the country's most respected families. They offer her, in short, everything that her mother currently cannot. Vivienne Beaumont looked at me while her lawyer spoke, not with cruelty exactly, with something more clinical than that. The look of a woman who has spent 63 years getting what she wanted by understanding exactly what everything cost and who held which card. She thought she held every card in this room. Judge Colomb, who was 55 and had the focused, slightly exhausted look of someone who had heard every variety of human dishonesty and had developed a finely calibrated instrument for detecting it, looked at me over her reading glasses. Madame Vasquez, you have heard the application. You may respond. I looked at my own lawyer, Maître Dubois, a quiet, precise woman of 47 whom I had hired specifically because she was the opposite of theatrical. She never performed. She simply won. She gave me a small, composed nod. I stood up, I smoothed my blazer, I looked at Judge Colomb directly, and I said in a voice that did not shake and did not perform and did not betray a single degree of the temperature running beneath it. Your Honor, before I address the substance of Maître Renard's application, I would like to ask the court's permission to present certain documentation that I believe will significantly reframe the picture my ex-husband's family has just offered you. Maître Renard looked faintly amused. He leaned toward Etienne and said something quietly that made Etienne's mouth curve into a small, satisfied smile. I reached into my leather portfolio, plain dark brown, bought at a market stall in the 11th arrondissement, because I had been playing a particular role for a very specific period of time. And the portfolio was part of the costume, and I placed my hand on a sealed folder that was approximately 4 centimeters thick. Across the aisle, Vivienne Beaumont's eyes moved to the folder. Something shifted in her expression. Not fear, not yet, but the first intimation of a question she had not thought to ask. Good, I thought. Start asking. Before I tell you what was in that folder, I need to tell you how we arrived in that courtroom. Because the Beaumont family's campaign against me did not begin with lawyers and emergency custody applications. It began, as most campaigns of this kind do, with something smaller, with a dinner and a conversation and a choice that a man made when he thought no one significant was watching. I had met Etienne Beaumont at a private dinner in the 7th arrondissement 7 years ago. I was 30 at the time, working as a sous chef at a restaurant called Ardoise, a small, serious place on a quiet street near the Musée d'Orsay that had 1 Michelin star and the kind of devoted clientele that made reservations 3 months in advance and never posted photographs of their food on social media. The owner, a fierce 70-year-old Breton named Chef Morvan, had trained me for 6 years and had told me once, in the particular way of French culinary mentors, gruff, reluctant, magnificent, that I had the palate of someone who understood that cooking was an argument and that every plate was a position. I was at that dinner not as a guest, but as part of a private catering team Chef Morvan had assembled for a function hosted by a publishing executive. Etienne was a guest. He had wandered into the kitchen near the end of the evening, slightly flushed from the wine, and had told me with genuine, disarming sincerity that the lamb I had prepared was the best thing he had eaten in 5 years. I had thanked him and told him that the lamb had done most of the work. He had laughed a real laugh, not a performance, and we had talked for 40 minutes in the warm kitchen while the dining room emptied. What I did not know at the time, because Etienne was careful and deliberate about certain kinds of information, was that he was a Beaumont, that his mother ran a media empire, that his family operated by a set of rules that had nothing to do with the rules by which ordinary people navigated the world. I learned these things gradually over the 18 months of our courtship, in the way you learn the true geography of a landscape you have been moving through, realizing that what felt like open ground was actually carefully managed terrain and that the paths that seemed natural were the ones someone had chosen to keep clear. By the time I understood fully what the Beaumont family was, I was pregnant with Sophie and deeply in love with the version of Etienne I had believed was real, and the version of Etienne the First had believed was real. Curious, warm, genuinely interested in the world, the man who knew the names of the fishmongers at every market we visited, and who read poetry in the bath, and who had driven 4 hours to Normandy one winter weekend just because I had mentioned once that I wanted to see the sea in the cold. That version was not entirely constructed. Parts of him were real. They were just not the dominant parts. Not when his mother was in the room. Vivienne Beaumont had accepted me with the gracious efficiency of a woman who has accepted many unplanned things and has learned to manage them. She did not dislike me personally. I came to understand this clearly over the 6 years of our marriage. Vivienne did not deal in personal feelings. She dealt in utility. I had produced a grandchild. I ran a household efficiently. I was photogenic enough not to embarrass the family at events. I was useful for a time. The trouble began when I became less useful than the alternative. The alternative arrived in the form of a woman named Isabelle Fontaine. 29 years old, daughter of a Lyon industrialist family possessed of impeccable bloodlines and the particular kind of cultivated beauty that French society families spend generations producing. Vivian had introduced them at a charity gala when Sophie was 4 years old. Etienne had told me it was nothing. He had said this for approximately 8 months, while it was in fact very much something. I found out the way most people find out these things, not through a dramatic revelation, but through an accumulation of small incongruences that my professional instincts trained to notice detail could not continue to explain away. The dinner meetings that ran later than plausible. The phone left face down. The particular quality of absence in a person who is physically present. I am a chef. My entire profession is built on the precise observation of how things actually are, rather than how they are presented. I see what is in front of me. The divorce was not acrimonious in the courtroom sense. Etienne was not cruel in the obvious way. He was simply managed by his mother, by the family's legal team, by the understanding that the Beaumont name and the Beaumont assets were to be protected above all other considerations, including the feelings of the woman he was leaving. The settlement had been structured by Maître Renard in a way that was technically fair under French law and practically devastating in terms of what it left me to build from. I received the contents of our joint account, which Etienne had been quietly reducing for 18 months prior to the divorce filing. I received no property because everything had been held in structures that predated our marriage. I received child support that was calculated against a declared income of Etienne's that bore I came to understand later only a partial relationship to his actual financial position. What I did not receive and what Vivian had apparently decided from the beginning that I would not receive was any foothold in the world that the Beaumont family controlled. Their media properties did not cover restaurants that employed me. Their magazine titles ran pieces about the new faces of French cuisine that systematically omitted my name. Their television food programming, which reached millions of French households, invited every credible chef in Paris to appear except one. I was erased, slowly, professionally, without a single fingerprint left on the erasure, and I let them believe it was working. Here is what the Beaumont family knew about my life for the 4 years following the divorce. They knew because their retained investigative firm had documented it carefully that I was living in a series of small, furnished apartments in the 11th, 12th, and 20th arrondissements. They knew I drove a 10-year-old Citroën with a cracked rear bumper. They knew I worked irregular catering shifts and occasional private dinner events, and that my declared income was modest, sometimes barely sufficient, and that I was in the financial picture their investigators painted a woman who was managing but barely, who was with a sufficiently aggressive legal push, vulnerable. They did not know about Michel. Michel Armand was 68 years old, a retired restaurateur who had spent 40 years building and selling 3 separate successful restaurant groups across France and 1 in Brussels. He had been Chef Morvin's oldest friend and my professional mentor's mentor, which meant he had known of my existence since I was 24 years old and had watched my development with the particular interested attention of someone who recognizes in another person the thing they once recognized in themselves. When my marriage ended, Michel had called me not to offer sympathy, which he knew I did not need, but to offer something more useful. A conversation. We had met at his apartment in the 6th, a large warm space full of cookbooks and wine and 40 years of accumulated professional knowledge, and he had looked at me for a long time with those sharp, kind eyes and had said, "You have 2 choices. You can spend the next several years trying to re-enter a market that one family has decided to close to you, or you can build a market they have not thought to close because they do not know it exists yet. Which is more interesting to you?" The second one I had told him. Obviously the second one. What Michel and I built over the next 4 years in the deliberate privacy of structures that the Beaumont investigative firm had no reason to examine because they bore no connection to. My name was a private dining company called Origine that operated exclusively through personal referral, serving ultra-high net worth clients who required the highest level of culinary discretion, private residences, yacht charters, corporate retreats, the kind of events where the food was exceptional and the guest list never appeared in any media property, including the ones controlled by Groupe Beaumont. Origine's clientele included 4 former heads of state, the CFOs of 2 major European banks, 3 generations of a Gulf royal family who maintained a permanent residence outside Paris, and a reclusive American technology billionaire who ate with us 6 times a year and had told Michel that our tasting menu was the single meal he looked forward to most in the world. Origine was not registered in my name. It was held through a corporate structure that Michelle's lawyers, not mine, had established with me as the controlling operating partner under a professional pseudonym I had used since the beginning, Elena Voss. Not Vasquez, not Beaumont, a clean name that belonged to nobody's story but mine. In 4 years, Origine had served over 300 private events. Our client retention rate was 94%. Our revenue for the preceding fiscal year had been slightly over 4 million euros. My personal income from the partnership after Michelle's share in operating costs had been just under 1.2 million euros, none of which appeared on the tax declarations the Beaumont investigators had access, because it was declared under the corporate structure properly and completely by accountants whose discretion was contractually absolute. I had a penthouse apartment in the Marais that I had purchased 18 months ago through a property holding company Michelle's lawyers had structured. It had 4 bedrooms, a professional kitchen that I had designed myself, and a view of the rooftops of Paris that made me feel every morning when I stood at the window with my coffee that the city was something I had built rather than something I was navigating. Sophie knew about the apartment. She called it our real house and kept a painting she had made of the kitchen on the wall of her bedroom. There, a bright, confident explosion of yellow and orange and the deep red of a sauce she had watched me reduce for 40 minutes one Saturday afternoon. I had told Sophie with the careful honesty I had always tried to give her that we were keeping our real house a special secret for a little while longer. She had accepted this in the way of children who trust the parent who has never misled them, not without questions, but with the understanding that the questions would be answered when the time was right. The time was now right. I need to tell you what happened 12 days before the courtroom because the court appearance did not begin with Maître Renard's opening. It began at a dinner party on a houseboat moored on the Seine on a cold February evening, when the river was the color of old pewter and the lights of the bridges made the water look like something from a story. Etienne had invited me through his assistant and with unusual formality to a family gathering to discuss co-parenting arrangements going forward, which was Beaumont family language, for we have decided to change the terms and we are inviting you to the conversation as a courtesy before we proceed without you. I had accepted because I wanted to understand exactly what they were planning and because I had learned over 4 years of managing my situation that information gathered directly is always more reliable than information gathered secondhand. The houseboat belonged to Vivienne. She owned several properties in Paris, and the houseboat was the one she used for intimate gatherings, small enough to be exclusive, unusual enough to be memorable, floating on the Seine with a kind of magnificent, deliberate symbolism, as if even her social calendar was conducted from a position elevated above the ordinary world. Sophie was not there. She was with me in the car, my deliberate crack-bumper Citroën, until we arrived at the Pont de l'Alma, at which point my sister Carla, who had driven up from Lyon that morning, took Sophie for an evening of crêpes and cinema, while I went aboard. Carla knew something significant was happening. She asked no questions. She took my daughter's hand and they walked away toward the lights of the city, and I watched them go and felt the particular focused calm that comes before a thing you have been preparing for. The gathering aboard was small. Vivienne, Etienne, Margot, and the Beaumont family's personal financial advisor, a man named Frédéric, who wore an expression of permanent mild apology and had the specific energy of someone who has spent his career being useful to people who would not have thought of him as a friend. And a surprise I registered without showing Isabelle Fontaine, Etienne's girlfriend, sitting very close to Etienne on the curved banquette, wearing a cream wool dress and an expression of practiced warmth that did not quite reach her eyes when they landed on me. Vivienne gestured for me to sit. She poured wine without asking whether I wanted it. The houseboat rocked very slightly on the dark river. The windows were fogged at the edges from the warmth inside. "We appreciate you coming, Elena," Vivienne said. She had always used my first name with the particular inflection of a woman who considers first names a form of management rather than intimacy. We thought it was important to have this conversation directly out of respect for the time we have shared. "Of course," I said. "Etienne and Isabelle are planning to formalize their relationship this summer." Vivienne continued, her voice as smooth and steady as the river outside. "They intend to establish a home together. In this context, we believe it is in Sophie's best interest to have a primary residence that provides the stability and resources that her current situation with you simply cannot offer." She paused. "We are not suggesting you be removed from Sophie's life. We are suggesting an adjustment that reflects the realities of the current situation." "What adjustment specifically?" I asked. Margot took this one. She had been watching me with the professional attention of someone who had made her career assessing how messages landed. "Primary custody transferred to Etienne with generous visiting rights for you, weekends, school holidays, the standard framework. We would of course continue the child support arrangement, though given the adjustment in residential arrangements, the calculation would naturally be revisited." Revisited, meaning reduced, meaning that the modest income they believed was my primary financial support would be further diminished to ensure that Sophie's comfort and mine became progressively contingent on their goodwill. It was a very complete plan. I could see the architecture of it clearly, the pressure points, the leverage structures, the exits they had closed before I arrived. It was the work of people who were very good at what they did and who had been doing it for a long time. Etienne had not spoken yet. He was looking at the table in front of him with an expression I recognized from the last years of our marriage, the expression of a man who has agreed to something he is not entirely comfortable with and has decided that comfort is not the point. I looked at him until he met my eyes. He held my gaze for almost 3 seconds before he looked away. Isabel placed her hand lightly on his arm. He did not pull away. I understand, I said. I picked up the glass of wine Vivian had poured for me, and I took a measured sip and I set it back down precisely in its ring on the polished table. Thank you for explaining this directly. I appreciate the clarity. I looked at Vivian. I'll need some time to review this with my own representation. Vivian nodded with the gracious finality of a woman who considered the conversation concluded. Of course. We've instructed Maitre Renard to file the formal application with the court on Monday. We wanted you to hear it from us first. They were filing Monday. The hearing was 2 weeks away. They expected me to spend those 2 weeks panicking, calling court-appointed lawyers, scrambling for documentation I did not have, trying to assemble a financial picture that would survive even a cursory challenge. They expected me to arrive in that courtroom, diminished, not destroyed, because they were not cruel in the uncalculated sense, but sufficiently reduced that the outcome was not in question. I set down my wine glass. I smiled at Vivian genuinely, with warmth, the smile of a woman who is grateful for clarity. Thank you for the wine, I said. It's excellent. Meursault 2019. Vivian blinked just once, the tiniest disruption in the smooth surface. Yes, you have a good palate. I was trained carefully, I said. And I stood and I said goodnight to the room and I walked off the houseboat and up the stone steps to the quay and into the cold Paris night and I called Michel before I had reached the first bridge. They're filing Monday, I told him. I know, he said. He had expected it since January. Are you ready? I've been ready for 2 years, I said. The 12 days between the houseboat dinner and the courtroom were the 12 most productive days of my professional life. Not in the culinary sense, though we did serve a private dinner for 16 on the Thursday that I was particularly proud of, but in the investigative and organizational sense. Because if there is one thing a professional chef understands more completely than most people, it is the difference between a mise en place that merely looks prepared and one that actually is. The Beaumont family had a mise en place that looked immaculate. I had one that actually was. Michel's lawyers, a firm called Cabinet Armand et Associés, deliberately named to sound like an art consulting firm and therefore invisible to anyone who was not specifically looking for it, had spent the preceding 4 years documenting origins, activities, revenues, and my professional standing within the private dining world with the same precision I applied to a tasting menu. Every event, every client satisfaction record, every tax declaration, every partnership agreement, every asset held under the corporate structure. It was not a folder, it was an archive. And they had prepared a court-ready summary of it, sealed and certified by 3 independent accountants that ran to 68 pages. But the financial documentation was only the first layer. The second layer was something I had been building more quietly and more personally for a different reason. My daughter was 9 years old. She was perceptive, sensitive, fiercely intelligent, and deeply loyal qualities she had developed in part because she had needed them. Sophie attended a private school in the 7th arrondissement where she had been enrolled since she was 5, and her teachers had over the years provided written assessments of her progress that were routinely warm and detailed. I had kept every single one. I had also, with the full knowledge and approval of Sophie's school counselor, maintained a contact journal, a simple record of communications, events, and observations relevant to Sophie's welfare and our co-parenting arrangement. In that journal were 147 entries over 4 years. They included Etienne's missed scheduled visits, 23 of them, all documented with text messages showing his last-minute cancellations. They included occasions when Sophie had returned from her father's residence, upset with notes of what she had reported and how it had been addressed. They included Vivian's 3 attempts over the past year to enroll Sophie in activities during my custodial time without my prior knowledge or consent. They included Margot's single ill-advised phone call to Sophie's school principal, which I had learned about from the principal herself, in which Margot had apparently suggested that Sophie's mother's professional instability was something the school might want to be aware of for planning purposes. The principal, a formidable woman named Madame Chatel, who had been educating the children of Paris's professional class for 30 years and had a finely developed sensitivity to attempts to weaponize institutional channels against parents, had told Margot politely that the school's relationship with Sophie's mother was entirely satisfactory and that she would not be entertaining unsolicited commentary on family matters from third parties. Then she had called me and told me what had happened. I had thanked her and added the entry to the journal. The third layer of my preparation was the most recent, and it had arrived not through any action of my own, but through the particular grace of an unlikely source. 3 days after the houseboat dinner, my phone rang with an unknown number. I almost did not answer. When I did, the voice on the other end was male quiet and carrying the weight of someone who had made a decision that was costing him something. "This is Frederic Morel," the voice said. "Frederic, the financial advisor from the houseboat. The man with the expression of permanent mild apology. I need to tell you something. I want to be clear that I am not doing this for any reason, except that I have a daughter myself, and what I was asked to prepare last week crossed a line that I am not willing to cross quietly." I sat down. "Tell me," I said. What Frederic told me in a careful and precise 40-minute conversation that I recorded with his explicit permission was this. He had been instructed by Maitre Renard on behalf of Vivienne Beaumont to prepare a financial analysis of my situation that would be submitted as an expert financial opinion to the court. This analysis was based on selective documentation. Specifically, it used my personal tax declarations, which showed modest income while deliberately omitting any reference to the corporate structure through which my actual income flowed, a structure that Frederic had himself helped to identify during the Beaumont family's due diligence on my finances. The resulting document painted a picture of a woman earning approximately 18,000 euros per year from irregular catering work. It was not technically a forgery. It was absolutely a deliberate misrepresentation designed to deceive a family court judge. "I told Maitre Renard I would not sign it," Frederic said. "He told me the Beaumont family would ensure I never worked with a major client in Paris again if I refused." He paused. "I signed it, and I have spent 3 days unable to sleep." "Why are you calling me?" I asked. "Because I signed it," he said simply. "And because there is a 9-year-old child involved, and because I am better than this, or at least I was once." He told me everything. The specific documents that had been selectively used, the analysis he had signed, the instruction he had received, the name of the Beaumont family's investigative firm, and the scope of their surveillance of my activities. All of it in careful detail recorded and logged. I thanked Frederic Morel with complete sincerity. I told him that his call had made a material difference. I did not tell him the full extent of what I already knew, because some information is more powerful when it arrives in a courtroom than when it is communicated in advance. Then I called Maitre Dubois and told her we had everything. "Everything," she said. "Everything," I confirmed, including their expert witness. There was a brief silence on the line. Then Maitre Dubois said in the quiet, satisfied tone of a woman who had spent 20 years waiting for cases this well documented, "Then let's make sure we present it correctly. I want to take you back to that courtroom, to the moment I placed the sealed folder on the table in front of me and watched something shift in Vivienne Beaumont's expression. Judge Colombe had instructed me to proceed with my response. Maitre Dubois was on her feet. She did not raise her voice. She did not use the theatrical gestures of Maitre Renard's expensive performance. She simply began to build with methodical precision the actual picture. "Your Honor," Maitre Dubois said, "before we address the substance of the petitioner's allegations, I would like to ask the court to note that the financial analysis submitted by the petitioner as Exhibit 3 was prepared by a financial advisor who was retained and instructed by the petitioner's own legal team. It is not an independent expert opinion. It is a commissioned document. I will demonstrate this momentarily." She nodded to me. I broke the seal on the folder. I removed the first section, the orgy and corporate documentation, and passed it to the court bailiff, who carried it to Judge Colombe's bench. "What you are looking at, Your Honor, is the complete financial and operational record of a private dining company called Origin, of which my client is the controlling operating partner. This company has been in operation for 4 years. Its most recent annual revenue was 4.2 million euros. My client's personal income from this partnership in the preceding fiscal year was 1.18 million euros, declared in full under French tax law through the corporate structure." Maitre Dubois paused to allow the judge to examine the cover page. "My client is not financially destitute. My client is one of the most sought-after private dining professionals in Europe. The courtroom was quiet in a way that had a specific quality, the quality of a room in which several people have just been required to significantly recalibrate. I looked at Etienne. His face had gone the particular pale of someone who has been told a certainty is not certain. His jaw was slightly open. Beside him, Margot had gone very still, the way of someone whose professional instincts have registered a problem that their personal emotions have not yet caught up to. And Vivian was looking at me. Not with anger, not yet. With the focused attention of a chess player who has just realized that there is a piece on the board they had not accounted for. Your Honor, Maître Renard said, and I could hear under the professional smoothness the first slight roughness of a man who is improvising. This is entirely unexpected, and I would request a brief recess, too. Maître Renard, Judge Coulombe said, without looking up from the documents in front of her, you have had 2 weeks to prepare your case. The respondent is responding to your application. You will have the opportunity to cross-examine and to respond in turn. Please sit down. He sat down. Maître Dubois continued. She presented the property documentation the Marais apartment purchased 18 months ago, photographed by a certified property inspector who had assessed it as a safe, beautiful, and entirely appropriate home for a child. She presented Sophie's school records, 4 years of consistent, excellent academic performance, and a report from Madame Chatel that described Sophie's home life with her mother as stable, nurturing, and characterized by exceptional parental engagement. She presented the contact journal, all 147 entries certified and indexed, and drew the court's specific attention to the 23 documented instances of Etienne's canceled scheduled visits. Maître Renard objected to the journal's admission. Judge Coulombe overruled him in the flat tone of someone who has heard the objection before and found it unpersuasive. Then Maître Dubois set down her papers and looked at the court with the quiet gravity of someone saving the most significant thing for last. Your Honor, I would now like to address the financial analysis submitted by the petitioner as Exhibit 3, the document that forms the primary evidentiary basis for their claim that my client is financially incapable of providing for her daughter. She produced Frédéric Morel's recorded testimony. She produced the documentation of his instructions from Maître Renard. She produced the precise comparison between what the Beaumont family's investigators had known about my corporate structure documented in their own surveillance reports, which Frédéric had described in detail, and what they had chosen to include in the court submission. The petitioner's family, Maître Dubois said, her voice steady and completely without drama, was aware that my client operated a successful private dining company generating substantial income. They chose to submit to this court an expert financial analysis that deliberately excluded this information in order to create a false impression of my client's financial standing. This is not a matter of incomplete information. This is a matter of a document prepared with the specific intent to deceive a family court judge. She looked at Maître Renard. He was looking at the table in front of him with the fixed concentration of a man who is deciding what is still salvageable. I would ask the court to note, Maître Dubois continued, that the submission of a fraudulent expert opinion to a French family court is a matter that falls within the purview of the Conseil National des Barreaux disciplinary procedures, as well as potential criminal provisions under the French Penal Code regarding the submission of false evidence in judicial proceedings. The room had gone very quiet, the kind of quiet that has weight. Vivian Beaumont spoke for the first time. She said in a voice that was still controlled but had lost its warmth entirely, Maître Renard. Maître Renard did not look at her. He was already writing something on his legal pad very quickly with the focused efficiency of a man revising his position. Judge Coulombe set down the Origine documentation, removed her reading glasses, and cleaned them with the deliberate care of someone who uses a small physical action to impose order on a moment that has gotten away from where she expected it to be. She put her glasses back on. She looked at both tables. I'm going to take a brief recess, she said. During this recess, I would like Sophie to be brought from the anteroom. When we resume, I will speak with her directly in the presence of both parents and the child advocate before I hear any further argument. She looked at me, then at Etienne. I want to be absolutely clear about the nature of this conversation. It is not a cross-examination. It is not an opportunity for either party to signal prompt or influence the child's responses in any way. If I observe any such attempt, I will note it in my ruling, and it will weigh heavily on my assessment of that parent's fitness. She looked at Maître Renard for a half-second longer than she looked at Maître Dubois. We will resume in 15 minutes. The recess was 15 minutes in the physical sense and significantly longer in every other sense. I sat in the corridor on a wooden bench, and Maître Dubois sat beside me and said nothing, which was exactly right. I watched the dust move in the column of light that came through the high window above the court entrance. And I thought about Sophie, about the morning she had been born, the specific, overwhelming reality of her, the way she had looked at me for the first time with those dark eyes that were already entirely her own. And I steadied myself on that memory the way a navigator steadies on a fixed point. Madame Lefebvre, the child advocate, appeared at the far end of the corridor holding Sophie's hand. Sophie was wearing her navy school coat over a red dress, her dark hair in two plaits that she had done herself, slightly uneven, stubbornly, her own. She saw me, and her face did the thing that 9-year-olds' faces do when they see the parent they have been separated from, even briefly, a quick involuntary brightening, immediately contained by the awareness that this was a serious place with serious rules. I opened my arms slightly. She crossed the corridor in 4 quick steps and pressed herself against me, and I held her for a moment, my face in her hair, breathing. "Are you okay?" I asked quietly. "Yes," she said. "Then, Madame Lefebvre has very interesting earrings." I laughed a small, real laugh. "Good to know," I said. When we returned to the courtroom, Judge Coulombe had rearranged the physical space slightly. The formal adversarial geometry of the 2 opposing tables had been softened. A chair had been placed in front of the bench, turned slightly so that it faced both the judge and the room without facing either table directly. Sophie was guided to this chair by Madame Lefebvre, who took a position slightly behind and to one side. Etienne watched Sophie cross the room. Whatever complicated thing he felt in that moment, and I believed, as I had always believed, that his feelings for Sophie were genuine, even when everything else was not. It moved across his face and was gone. Judge Coulombe leaned forward. She had the gift which I had noticed from the beginning of shifting her register entirely when she spoke to a child, not condescending, not performing warmth, but genuinely present in a different way than she was present with the adults in the room. "Sophie," she said, "my name is Judge Coulombe. Do you know why you're here today?" Sophie nodded. "Because Papa and Mama can't agree about where I should live," she said, factual, calm, not rehearsed. She had always been a child who stated things as they were. "That's right," the judge said. "I want to talk to you for a few minutes just to understand how things are for you. Is that all right?" "Yes," Sophie said. "Where do you live right now most of the time?" "With Mama, in our apartment." "And do you like it there?" Sophie considered this with the seriousness she brought to most questions. "Yes, Mama has a very good kitchen. She lets me help sometimes. She's teaching me to make pastry." A pause. "I'm not very good at it yet, but she says that's normal." Judge Coulombe's expression did not change, but something in her eyes shifted almost imperceptibly. "Do you see your Papa regularly?" "When he doesn't have to work," Sophie said with the matter-of-fact tone of a child who has processed an absence and filed it under, "This is how things are." "Sometimes he has to cancel. He always says he's sorry." "How do you feel when he cancels?" Sophie looked at her hands for a moment. "Sad, but then Maman takes me somewhere nice instead, so it's okay." She looked up. "She took me to see the illuminations at the Grand Palais last time. That was good." "I'd like to ask you something a little more serious," Judge Coulombe said. Her voice was unchanged, no added gravity, no shift that might signal to Sophie that an important answer was expected. "Has anyone, any adult, your Papa, your Grandma Vivian, anyone told you what to say today? Or what you should tell me about where you want to live?" The room was very still. I watched Sophie's face. She was not afraid. She was thinking, which was different. "Grand-mère Vivian said I should tell the judge that I love Papa very much," Sophie said. "Do you?" "Yes." "And do you love your Mama?" "Yes." Sophie said this with a different quality than the first answer, simpler, more total. "I love Maman differently. Maman is there." She thought about this. "Papa is there too sometimes, but Maman is always there." She reached into the pocket of her school coat, then with the decisive movement of someone who has been waiting for the right moment, she produced a small, carefully folded piece of paper. "I wrote something down," she told Judge Coulombe, "because I thought I might be nervous and forget. Is it okay if I read it?" Judge Coulombe looked at Madame Lefebvre, who gave a small confirming nod. She had seen the paper before it had been Sophie's own idea, prepared the evening before in Carlo's apartment while I was elsewhere. "Of course," the judge said. Sophie unfolded the paper. Her handwriting was large and very clear. She had taken her time. She read, "I want to live with my mother, not because I don't love my father, but because when I am sick, it is my mother who comes. When I am scared, it is my mother who stays. When I need someone to understand something, it is my mother who explains. My father's family has a bigger house, but a bigger house is not the same as a home. My mother's home is where I am safe. That is where I want to be." She folded the paper again and put it back in her pocket with the composed tidiness of someone who has said exactly what she meant to say and does not feel the need to add to it. Judge Colombe was very still for a moment. Then she wrote something on her pad. She wrote for almost 30 seconds, which in a room that quiet felt much longer. "Thank you, Sophie," she said. "That was very clear and very brave. Madame Lefebvre will take you back to the anteroom now." Sophie stood. As she passed behind my chair, she briefly, lightly touched my shoulder with the tips of her fingers, so quick it could almost have been an accident. It was not an accident. I kept my hands folded on the table and my eyes forward, and I breathed. From across the aisle, I heard Vivienne Beaumont exhale a small, controlled sound that contained within it an entire recalculation. The confrontation I had been waiting for did not happen immediately after Sophie left the room. It happened in the way real confrontations happen in stages, with the slow revelation of the full picture, unfolding across several hours of formal proceedings during which Maitre Renard's confident legal architecture was systematically disassembled, not with drama, but with documentation. After Sophie's departure, Judge Colombe called for the petitioner to respond to the financial documentation Maitre Dubois had presented. Maitre Renard's response was careful and professional and entirely inadequate because there is a specific kind of inadequacy that afflicts a well-prepared lawyer when the fundamental premise of his case has been removed. He made 3 arguments. Maitre Dubois addressed each one directly with a specificity that left nothing to interpretation. Etienne was called to the stand. He was questioned by Maitre Dubois about the missed visits, 23 of them, each documented with the exact date and his own text message confirming the cancellation. He confirmed each one without contesting them. He had no choice. They were his own words. He was asked about the Thanksgiving cancellation 3 weeks before the court filing. He had canceled his scheduled Christmas visit with Sophie at 2 days' notice to attend a ski trip in Courchevel with Isabelle and a group of her family friends. He confirmed this also. He was asked whether when he filed the emergency custody application, he had been aware that the financial analysis submitted as Exhibit 3 was based on incomplete information about the respondent's income. He paused. His lawyer objected. The objection was overruled. He said that he had trusted his legal team to prepare the documentation appropriately. Maitre Dubois pressed, had he personally been aware that the respondent operated a successful private dining company? Another pause. "I knew she did some private catering," he said carefully. "Some private catering," Maitre Dubois repeated, "generating over 4 million euros in annual revenue." Etienne looked at the table. "I was not fully aware of the scope," he said. "Who provided the instructions to the financial advisor regarding the scope of the analysis?" Maitre Dubois asked. "I believe those discussions were handled by our legal team." "By Maitre Renard, on instructions from whom?" Maitre Renard objected loudly. The objection was sustained on the grounds of legal privilege, but the question had been asked and the room had heard it, and Judge Colombe had written something on her pad. Margot was called next. She had not been listed as a witness either, but Judge Colombe had the authority to call individuals present in the courtroom, and she exercised it. Margot's presence at the houseboat dinner and her professional role as Chief Communications Officer of Groupe Beaumont made her directly relevant to questions about the media landscape's treatment of the respondent. Maitre Dubois asked Margot calmly and precisely whether the editorial decisions of Groupe Beaumont's publications and programming regarding chefs and restaurant professionals were made independently of the family's personal relationships and interests. Margot said yes. Maitre Dubois produced a brief documentary review prepared by a media analysis firm Michel had retained for this specific purpose, showing the pattern of omission across 4 years and 8 separate Groupe Beaumont properties. She did not call it what it was, she simply showed it. Numbers, dates, names. And the one name that was consistently absent. Judge Colombe looked at the document for a long time. Margot's face, over the course of this presentation, moved through a sequence of expressions that I had observed in professional context before the face of someone very competent watching their competence fail them, because competence in the end is only as good as the information it operates on. And Margot had been operating on the assumption that I was what her family's investigators had described. Then Vivienne spoke. She had not been called, but she rose from her chair and said with the full authority of a woman who had spent 60 years using authority as a blunt instrument, "Your Honor, I would like to address the court directly. Judge Colombe looked at her for a long, level moment. You are not a party to these proceedings, Madame Beaumont. You are here as a family member. The respondent's attorney has implied, Madame Beaumont. Judge Colombe's voice did not rise. It simply became very precise. Sit down. The most powerful media woman in France sat down. There was one more thing. There is always one more thing in these situations because people do not stop when they should, because desperation makes people reach for cards they should have left on the table. It was Margot who played it. She leaned to Maitre Renard and said something in a low, rapid voice, and Maitre Renard straightened and raised his hand. Judge Colombe acknowledged him. Your Honor, he said, and something in his tone had shifted into the register of a man playing his last chip and knowing it is his last chip. We have not yet addressed the question of the respondent's professional practices and their appropriateness as a context for raising a child. Specifically, the private dining company my colleague has presented, which serves as she herself has stated ultra-high net worth clients at private residences and yacht charters, operates in an environment that raises certain questions about the nature of the work and the hours involved, and whether that environment is compatible with stable, attentive parenting. He left the implication hanging in the room like smoke. He did not specify what the questions were. He did not need to. The implication was clear and it was ugly, and it was the last weapon in the arsenal if we cannot prove. She is poor. We will suggest something worse. I felt the temperature in the room shift. Maitre Dubois had gone very still in the particular way of someone selecting their response with great care. But before Maitre Dubois could stand, something unexpected happened. It had a quality of unexpectedness, in fact, that I had not anticipated, which was notable because I had anticipated quite a lot. From the second row of the gallery, a figure stood. He was tall, silver-haired, impeccably dressed in the understated way of someone for whom clothes are not a statement but a standard. He was 68 years old and moved with the ease of a man entirely comfortable in formal environments, which was appropriate because he had spent 40 years in them. Michel Armand. He had not told me he was coming. Your Honor, Michel said, and his voice carried across the courtroom with the natural authority of someone who had chaired board meetings and negotiated with government ministers and received the Légion d'honneur for his contribution to the French culinary tradition. My name is Michel Armand. I am a partner in the company whose documentation you have been reviewing this morning. I am also Elena Vasquez's professional mentor of 12 years. I would like to be heard. Maitre Renard began to object. Judge Colombe raised one hand and he stopped. She looked at Michel with the attentive focus she had given throughout these proceedings to the people who had actually had something worth saying. This is a family court, Monsieur Armand, not a professional tribunal. I understand completely. Your Honor, Michel said, I would like to speak to one specific point, the implication just raised by the petitioner's counsel, which I found to be both professionally inaccurate and personally offensive. He looked directly at Maitre Renard. Origine serves the most discerning private clients in Europe. It operates within the strictest professional and ethical standards in the industry. Every employee who works for it, including my partner, has been vetted, credentialed, and operates in accordance with the highest professional norms. There is nothing about Elena Vasquez's work or the environment in which she conducts it that is anything other than exemplary. He paused. I have also had the privilege of knowing Sophie Vasquez since she was 5 years old because her mother brought her to the kitchen one Saturday and she spent 3 hours asking me questions about sauces. She is one of the most remarkable 9-year-olds I have ever encountered. She is remarkable because of how she has been raised. Another pause. I wanted this court to hear that from someone who has watched it happen from close enough to see it clearly. He sat down. The courtroom was quiet in the particular way it had been quiet after Sophie read her letter. Not the silence of shock, but the silence of something that has been said well and does not need supplementing. Judge Colombe looked at Maitre Renard. Do you have anything else? She asked. He looked at his papers. He looked at Vivienne Beaumont. She was looking at the table. He looked back at the judge. No, Your Honor. Judge Colombe ruled from the bench. She did not take the case under advisement. She had everything she needed, and she said so in those exact words, and the directness of it seemed to carry a message of its own about how she had assessed the quality of what she had been given to work with by each side. She denied the emergency custody modification application in its entirety. She found that the petitioner had failed to demonstrate any material change in the circumstances that would justify a modification of the existing arrangements. and that the documentation submitted in support of the application had been selectively prepared in a manner she found troubling in its methodology and its implications for the integrity of these proceedings. She ordered the existing custody arrangement to continue without modification. She noted for the record that the contact journal presented by the respondent documenting 23 missed scheduled visits over 4 years raised questions about the petitioner's commitment to the existing arrangement that would be relevant to any future application. She stated that she was referring the matter of Exhibit 3, the financial analysis, to the appropriate professional body for review, and that she would be making a formal note of the circumstances of its preparation in the case record. She looked at both sides of the room with equal steady attention. "A child is not a property dispute," she said. "She is a person. The evidence I have heard today about Sophie Vasquez suggests that she is a thoughtful, stable, and emotionally healthy person. The primary factor in that outcome is evident from the record before me, and it is the consistent, present, attentive care of her mother. I would strongly encourage all parties to reflect on whether the resources and energy that have been directed toward this application could not be more usefully directed toward the child herself." She gathered her papers, she stood, the room stood, she was gone. I want to tell you about the 3 minutes in the corridor outside the courtroom because the story does not end in the room where the ruling is given. It continues in the space immediately after, when the formal structure dissolves and the human beings who have been performing their official roles have to encounter each other as themselves. Maitre Dubois and I walked out of the courtroom side by side. Madame Lefebvre was already in the corridor with Sophie, who had been told the outcome and was holding a small paper cup of water with both hands and looking at me with an expression of profound contained relief. I held her. A long moment, both of us quiet. Then I heard footsteps behind me and felt the quality of the air change in the particular way it changes when someone approaches who has something to say and is not certain they should say it. I turned. It was Etienne. He was alone. Maitre Renard had moved to one end of the corridor with his phone, and Margot was speaking to someone in a low, urgent voice near the exit, and Vivian had not yet appeared. Just Etienne, hands in his jacket pocket, standing a few feet away with the look of a man who has had something very clearly demonstrated to him and is in the process of integrating what it means. "I didn't know," he said, "about the financial analysis, about what his family had instructed Frederic to prepare." He said this quietly, and I heard something in it that I had learned over years to assess carefully the difference between a man who didn't know and a man who chose not to know, and whether the distinction matters when the outcome is the same. I looked at him for a moment. I looked at the father of my daughter, at the man I had loved, and the man he had become. And the gap between those things, and I said 23 times, Etienne. He looked at me without speaking. 23 times Sophie waited for you, and you didn't come. I documented every single one. Not to use against you, because someone had to keep the record of what actually happened, and you weren't going to. I kept my voice level. I was not angry. I had moved through the anger years ago into something clearer and more durable. She wrote that letter herself. I didn't ask her to. She did it because she wanted you to understand something, and she knew no one else would say it for her. He closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, he looked past me at Sophie, who had turned away and was looking at Madame Lefebvre's earrings, which were apparently genuinely interesting. Something moved across his face that I believed was real. "I'm sorry," he said. "I know," I said. Then I turned back to my daughter and took her hand, and we walked together down the long stone corridor of the Palais de Justice toward the doors toward the light. The morning after the ruling, I woke up at 5:15. This was not unusual. Chefs wake early not because the industry requires it universally, though it often does, but because the early morning hours have a quality of clarity that is genuinely useful for the kind of thinking that cooking requires. The planning, the sequencing, the consideration of what needs to happen in what order so that everything arrives at the right moment simultaneously. I had been waking at 5:15 for 15 years, and I expected to continue doing so for the rest of my professional life, and I found this fact entirely satisfying. I lay in the darkness of my bedroom in the Marais apartment for approximately 30 seconds, listening to the city, the particular hush of Paris at this hour, before the delivery trucks begin, and before the cafes pull their chairs from their stacked positions on the sidewalks, and before the metro crowd generates its specific daily frequency. Then I got up, put on coffee, and went to stand at the window. The rooftops of the Marais in early morning light are a specific thing that I do not think can be adequately communicated to anyone who has not stood in front of them with the particular combination of exhaustion and relief and earned peace that characterized my emotional state at 5:20 in the morning. on the day after the most important legal proceeding of my life. I will simply say that they were beautiful in the way that things are beautiful when you are finally in a position to look at them without calculating what you might lose. Sophie was asleep in her yellow room. She had named it that herself because I had let her choose the paint color, and she had chosen the specific yellow of a late summer lemon, which should have been aggressive and was somehow perfect. I had looked in on her at midnight when I went to bed, and she had been deeply, completely asleep, one arm flung over her head in the theatrical abandon that children achieve in sleep. I had stood in her doorway for a long time. Michel called at 6. This was also not unusual. "I owe you an apology," he said, "for appearing in court without telling you." "You owe me no such thing," I said. "I came because I wanted to," he said, "not because the legal strategy required it." "I know," I said, "that's why it worked." He laughed the specific laugh of a man who has been in the food industry for 40 years and has learned to appreciate the correct result regardless of the elegance of the path to it. "What are you making for breakfast?" "Rios." "Eggs," I said. "Sophie's choice. She'll want them scrambled with too much butter and a specific amount of fleur de sel that she has very strong opinions about." "Naturally," he said. "Call me when she wakes up. There are things to discuss, but they can wait for eggs." I made coffee. I prepared Sophie's breakfast things in advance, the way I prep for a service, everything in its place in the order it will be needed so that when the moment comes, the execution is clean. I thought about what Michel had said, there are things to discuss. There were. The ruling had closed one chapter with great finality, but it had also opened something else. Something I had been aware of for a long time and had deliberately deferred while the legal situation required my full attention and my deliberate invisibility. My invisibility was over. The ruling was a public record. Maître Dubois had confirmed that the financial documentation presented to the court would be available through standard legal disclosure processes. Origin, my work, my company, my professional life for 4 years was no longer a secret. The question now was what I did with that. I already knew the answer. I had known it for approximately 2 years. I had simply been waiting for the conditions that made it possible to act on. The professional and legal consequences for the Beaumont family and their legal team did not arrive dramatically or immediately. They arrive the way structural damage arrives in a building that has been constructed on a compromised foundation, gradually in stages, each one more significant than the last, until the full extent of what had been built on false premises became undeniable. Maître Renard faced the most immediate consequences. The referral Judge Colombe made to the Conseil National des Barreaux. The governing body of the French legal profession was not advisory. It was a formal complaint entered into the official record describing in precise judicial language the circumstances in which a financial analysis had been commissioned, prepared, and submitted to the court in a manner that the presiding judge had found troubling. The Conseil's disciplinary committee opened an inquiry within 3 weeks of the ruling. Frédéric Morel, who had signed the analysis and then called me, and whose recorded testimony had formed part of the evidentiary record, was also referred for review, but his position was materially different from Maître Renard's. He had come forward voluntarily. He had provided his testimony with full awareness of what it would cost him professionally. He had told the truth in circumstances where telling the truth required more personal courage than most people demonstrate. The disciplinary committee in reviewing his case took this into account. He received a formal caution and a 12-month supervised practice period rather than the more severe sanctions that might otherwise have applied. Maître Renard received something significantly less lenient. He had not come forward voluntarily. He had mounted the legal challenge, been exposed by it, and then watched his foundational evidence collapse in open court. The disciplinary committee found that he had directed the preparation of a court submission with deliberate disregard for its completeness and accuracy. He received an 18-month suspension from practice and was required to complete a formal retraining program in professional ethics, which I was told he found deeply humiliating, which was, I thought, appropriate. The Beaumont family's investigative firm, the private intelligence company that had spent 4 years documenting my personal life, monitoring my movements, and assessing my financial position, became subject to a separate inquiry after it emerged through the disciplinary proceedings that they had known about my corporate income structure for over a year and had provided that information to the Beaumont family's legal team without disclosing it in the commissioned financial analysis. There are regulations in France governing what private investigators can and cannot document and how that documentation can be used. The firm had operated within most of those regulations technically. They had operated outside the spirit of several of them in ways that the inquiry found relevant. Their operating license was placed under review for 6 months, and 2 of their senior operatives received formal warnings. None of this was satisfying in the way of revenge that satisfies. It was satisfying in the way that structural integrity satisfies the knowledge that the compromised elements have been identified and addressed, and that the building is standing correctly again. Vivian Beaumont called me. 14 days after the ruling on a Tuesday morning in late March, my phone rang with a number I recognized from the years of our marriage, not Vivian's personal mobile, which I no longer had, but the direct line to her office at Groupe Beaumont's headquarters near the Champs-Élysées. I knew the number because it had appeared on my phone many times during the 6 years when I was her son's wife, and her granddaughter's mother in the particular context of Vivian managing access and information with the efficiency of someone who had been managing both all her life. I let it ring twice before I answered. I was in the Origine kitchen at the time in the middle of developing a new spring menu with our pastry specialist, a young Lyonnaise named Anaïs, who had a remarkable instinct for texture. I stepped out of the kitchen and into the small office adjoining it, and I answered. Elena, Vivian's voice, entirely controlled, the voice of a woman who has experienced a setback and has already moved past the experiencing of it into the managing of it. Vivian, I said, a brief silence. In that silence, I heard because I had known this woman for 7 years and knew how to read her silences the way I knew how to read a menu for what was present, what was absent, and what the ordering implied, the specific quality of a woman who was about to say something that cost her. Not apologize. Vivian did not apologize. She renegotiated. The proceedings have been concluded, she said. The court has ruled. I think it is time for us to discuss how we move forward in a manner that is appropriate for Sophie. I agree, I said. Etienne has spoken to me at some length about the contact arrangement. He is committed to being more consistent going forward. I want to support that commitment. Another brief pause. I also want to say that the manner in which the financial documentation was prepared and submitted was not something I personally reviewed in detail, and I regret that it did not meet the standard that court proceedings require. This was as close as Vivian Beaumont would come, I understood, to what the moment actually required. I held the phone and looked through the glass window of the office at Anaïs piping something delicate and precise onto a small square of pastry, and I thought about what I wanted from this conversation and what was actually available, and I made the assessment. A professional makes not what I wish the situation was, but what it actually was and what could be built from it. Vivian, I said, I want the same thing I have always wanted, a stable co-parenting arrangement that centers Sophie's well-being. I want Etienne to show up when he says he will. I want Sophie to be able to love both her parents without feeling that she is navigating a conflict. That is the complete list. I paused. Everything else professionally, financially, publicly, I can manage myself. I have been managing it for 4 years. I will continue to manage it from here. I am aware of that, Vivian said, and I heard in those 4 words the specific acknowledgement that was the most she would give and the most I needed from her, the acknowledgement that she had underestimated me and understood now that she had, and that it would not happen again. We spoke for 7 more minutes about logistics, Sophie's summer schedule, the question of Etienne's participation in Sophie's end-of-year school concert, a practical calendar for the following months. It was a civilized conversation. It was not a warm one. It did not need to be. When I hung up, I went back into the kitchen. Anaïs looked up from her pastry. Good call, she asked. Productive, I said. What are you doing with that cream? Testing something, she said. I think the bergamot is a half measure too much. Show me, I said. And I picked up a spoon and came to stand beside her, and we tasted together, and she was right. It was a half measure too much, and we adjusted it, and the afternoon continued. Michelle and I had been planning the announcement for 8 months. We had discussed the timing carefully, the format, the specific language, the order in which things would be revealed. We are both people who plan, who understand that the execution of a significant thing is as important as the thing itself, and that the way you bring something into the world shapes how it is received and what it means. What we were bringing into the world was Origine's transition from a private referral-only operation to a semi-public one. Not a restaurant exactly. The word restaurant implied a fixed space, a walk-in trade, a nightly repetition that was not what we had built and not what we wanted to build. What we were opening was something for which the French culinary world did not yet have a precise category which suited us very well. A private dining atelier operating by advance appointment and personal recommendation with a maximum of 20 covers per event. serving tasting menus that changed entirely with each season and that I designed personally from ingredient to final plate, with the full creative authority of someone who had spent 15 years earning the right to that authority and 4 more years building the financial independence to exercise it without compromise. We were also, and this was the element I had thought about most carefully, announcing my own name. Not Elena Voss, Elena Vasquez. The name on my birth certificate, on my daughter's school records, on the diplomas that Chef Morvan had signed with his heavy, flourished hand when he told me I was ready. My name attached to my work visible in the world from which a family's media empire had worked for 4 years to erase it. The announcement went to 3 places simultaneously on a Monday morning in April. It went to the 2 French culinary publications that fell outside Group Beaumont's ownership, a precise and deliberate selection that Margot would certainly understand. When she read it, required knowledge of the ownership landscape. It went to the professional newsletter of the French Culinary Guild to which every serious chef in France subscribed. And it went through Michel's personal connections to the food editor of Le Monde, who ran it as a feature rather than an item under a headline that translated roughly as "The Chef Who Fed Europe in Secret is No Longer Secret." The feature was 4 pages. It covered the professional history I had spent 15 years building. It covered origin, its clients, our standards, our approach in the language of someone who had researched carefully and who understood what they were describing. It covered the Palais de Justice ruling in a single paragraph. Factual and unadorned, the court had ruled in favor of a mother who had, the feature noted, spent 4 years successfully concealing a flourishing career from the people who had been working to prevent her from having one. The feature included a photograph. I had chosen it myself, not a studio portrait, not the kind of image a publicist arranges, but a photograph taken by Anais on a Tuesday afternoon in the Origine kitchen. It showed me at the stove in my apron, holding a pan and looking at something slightly off camera with the specific focused attention that cooking actually requires. My hair was pulled back and slightly disordered by the steam. I looked like what I was, a woman in the middle of her work, entirely in her element. The phone calls started within 2 hours of the feature going live. I had expected some of them colleagues from the culinary world, journalists from publications outside the Beaumont universe, a food-focused digital platform that had been trying to interview me. They thought for 3 years and had not understood until now why every approach was met with polite deflection. I had not quite expected the volume or the speed or the specific calls that arrived by late afternoon. One of them was from the director of programming at France's public television broadcaster, which was emphatically not part of Group Beaumont's holdings. He had read the Le Monde feature and wanted to discuss a potential documentary series about the private dining world, its culture, its clientele, its craft. He mentioned that they had been looking for the right subject for 2 years and that Elena Vasquez was precisely the kind of profile the series required. I thanked him and told him I would think about it. I was not being modest. I genuinely needed to think about it because what I had built over 4 years was partly defined by its privacy and partly defined by its excellence, and the question of how much visibility served the work and how much competed with it was a real question that deserved a real consideration. But I told him I was interested, and that was the beginning of something else entirely. Margot Beaumont was a professional. Whatever she thought of me personally, whatever she thought of the ruling of the feature of the 4-page acknowledgement by Le Monde of the career, her family had spent 4 years trying to suppress. She managed it with the controlled efficiency of someone whose job required exactly that management. Group Beaumont's properties did not run a response. They did not attempt rebuttal or counter-narrative. They simply shifted. Within 3 weeks of the Le Monde feature, 2 of the Beaumont-controlled food publications had run their own pieces on the private dining world, professional, factually accurate, not mentioning origin by name, but clearly operating in the space the feature had opened. Within 6 weeks, one of their culinary television programs had changed its editorial direction, slightly beginning to cover the kind of high-end private culinary scene that they had previously left entirely uncovered. It was, I thought, the most honest acknowledgement they would ever make. They had been controlling a landscape, and I had demonstrated that the landscape was larger than their control. Now they were adjusting their coverage to the new map. One of the Beaumont magazines, not a food title, but their flagship Style and Culture Monthly, sent an interview request through a third-party publicist. The request was professionally worded and made no reference to the family connection. I looked at it for a long moment and then sent a one-line reply. Thank you for the interest. I will not be participating in Group Beaumont publications at this time. I did not add anything further. There was nothing to add. Margot herself sent a brief, formally professional email through a personal address I recognized from the years of our acquaintance. She said that she thought the work I had built was impressive and that she respected it. She said she hoped things could be collegial going forward for Sophie's sake. I read the email twice. I appreciated its professionalism and what it cost her in terms of the specific currency of pride. I replied that I agreed things should be collegial going forward and that I also hoped they would be. I meant both sentences. I was not interested in ongoing conflict with a woman whose primary crime in the end had been loyalty to her family and competence at her job, both of which were from certain angles attributes. What I would not do, and what I said to no one but Michelle and Major Dubois, was pretend that what had been done had not been done. The 4 years of systematic editorial exclusion were in the record. The commission financial analysis was in the record. The referral to the Conseil National des Barreaux was in the record. The records existed. They did not need my ongoing commentary. They simply were. I want to tell you about a Thursday evening in May, approximately 6 weeks after the ruling, because some of the most important things in this story did not happen in courtrooms or in professional negotiations or in the careful legal architecture of accountability. Some of them happened at a piano. Sophie had been taking piano lessons since she was 6. Her teacher, Madame Girard, was a patient woman of 60 who taught from her apartment in the 6th arrondissement, which smelled of old wood and sheet music and the specific warmth of a room where music had been made for many years. Sophie was not a prodigy. She was something I found more interesting than a prodigy. She was a child who worked, who understood that excellence came from repetition, and that repetition was not tedious, but accumulative, each iteration adding something the previous one had lacked. She had learned this, I believe, from watching me cook. On that Thursday evening in May, Sophie had her end-of-year recital at Madame Girard's studio. It was a small event, 6 students, their parents, a handful of relatives, a room arranged with folding chairs and a low table with tea. And the particular small cakes that Madame Girard always provided and that Sophie had informed me were not as good as yours, but still good, which is the best way to feel about other people's cooking. Etienne was there. This was the first time since the ruling that we had occupied the same physical space in a context that was not legally structured. He arrived precisely at the time Madame Girard had specified, which was notable, given the contact journal, and he sat on the opposite side of the folding chair arrangement from me. And when Sophie appeared in the doorway of the studio and saw both of us, the expression on her face was something I will keep in the place where I keep the things I do not want to forget. It was simply gladness. Uncomplicated present, both of them gladness. The gladness of a child who has been told in the language of her parents showing up that she is worth showing up for. She played Debussy. Clair de Lune, which is ambitious for a 9-year-old, but which Madame Girard had told me Sophie had insisted on when the recital program was being chosen, with the characteristic combination of stubbornness and quiet confidence that I recognize as definitively entirely Sophie. She played it imperfectly in the way of someone who has worked hard enough to get most of it right and not yet long enough to get all of it right, and the imperfections were as beautiful as the correct notes because they were honest and earned and hers. When she finished, she looked up from the keyboard with the slightly surprised expression of someone who has just discovered they can do something they were not entirely certain they could. The room applauded. Madame Girard nodded with the compact satisfaction of a teacher watching the work pay off. Sophie looked across the folding chairs and found me, and then found Etienne, and her mouth curved into the specific smile that I knew was Sophie's realest smile, the one without performance, the one that meant she was fully present in a moment she was glad to be in. I looked at Etienne without meaning to. He was looking at Sophie with an expression that I had not seen on his face in a very long time, open, unguarded, the expression of someone feeling something directly rather than managing it. He looked in that moment like the man I had talked to in the kitchen of a party on a quiet street near the Musée d'Orsay 9 years ago, who had told me with genuine, disarming sincerity that the lamb had done most of the work. I did not feel what I might once have felt about that observation. I felt something simpler and more final gratitude that Sophie had a father who was capable of looking at her that way in clear-eyed honesty about the distance between capability and consistency, and the recognition that the distance was his to close and that it was no longer my responsibility to manage whether he closed it. These were things I knew. I had known them for a long time. But knowing something and feeling the full, settled weight of it are different things. And on that May evening in Madame Girard's studio with Debussy still resonating in the warm air, I felt the full, settled weight. The conversation with the director of programming at the public television broadcaster became 3 conversations, which became a meeting, which became a proposal, which became, after 6 weeks of careful negotiation conducted by a media lawyer, I hired specifically for the purpose, a contract. The documentary series was called La Table Invisible, The Invisible Table. It was 6 episodes each, 50 minutes, covering the world of private dining in France and across Europe. It was not a cooking show in the format that most people recognize the demonstration, the recipe, the energetic host explaining techniques to a camera. It was something closer to what I would call a culinary documentary, an investigation of how and why certain kinds of extraordinary meals happen, what they mean to the people who make them and the people who receive them, and what the private dining world reveals about the relationship between food wealth, intimacy, and the specific human desire to be fed well. I was not the host in the conventional sense. I was the through line, the perspective through which the series moved the professional intelligence that organized what was shown and why. Michelle appeared in 4 of the 6 episodes. Anais appeared in 2. Our clients appeared several of them in the carefully anonymized ways we had negotiated their voices, their reflections on what they sought from the experiences we created for them without identifiers that would compromise the discretion that was central to what Origine offered. We filmed for 4 months. I worked with a director named Sebastian, who was 33 years old and had a remarkable instinct for the visual language of spaces where significant things happened. Quietly, he moved his camera through kitchens the way a good chef moves through a service with purpose and without noise. He told me once, watching the footage from a particularly long shoot in the Origine kitchen, that what we were making was a document about attention, what happens when people pay complete attention to one thing. I thought that was exactly right. The series aired in October. It ran on Sunday evenings, which is not prime time in the conventional sense, but is the prime time of people who choose what they watch, and it was received with the specific enthusiasm of something that fills a space that people had not known was empty. The critical response was strong enough to matter and specific enough to be useful. Reviewers wrote about the quality of the filmmaking, the intelligence of the perspective, the unusual intimacy of the access Sebastian had achieved. Several of them wrote about me, about my professional history, about the sensibility that came through in my relationship to the food and the people and the spaces. One review in a cultural weekly I respected described watching the series as the experience of being in the presence of someone who has thought about what they are doing long enough to know why it matters. I read that in the kitchen at 5:30 in the morning on the first Sunday after the premiere with a cup of coffee and the particular quiet of the apartment before Sophie woke up. I read it twice. Then I folded the paper and put it on the kitchen counter and made Sophie's breakfast things in advance in the order they would be needed so that when she woke up, everything was ready. Frédéric Morel called me in July. Not about anything official, the disciplinary proceedings were concluded and his supervised practice period was underway, and there was nothing further that required contact between us. He called because he wanted to say something, and I respected the fact that he called rather than sent a message because some things require a voice. "I've been thinking about why I called you," he said. "Back in February, I've been thinking about it a lot actually in the way you think about things when you're not sure you made the right decision and you're trying to work out what the right decision actually was." "What conclusion did you reach?" I asked. "That I made the right decision," he said, "but for a messier reason than I thought at the time." A pause. "I told you I called because I had a daughter. That was true, but I also called because I had spent 20 years telling myself that I was a professional who operated within the systems I was given, and that if those systems produced outcomes I was uncomfortable with, that was the system's responsibility and not mine. And then I drafted a document that I knew was going to be used to take a child away from her mother, and I signed it and I couldn't sleep, and I realized that 20 years of professional distance is a very expensive way to avoid the moment when you discover what you actually are." He paused again. "I'm sorry I signed it in the first place. I wanted to say that directly." "I know," I said. "I accepted your apology the day you called me. That hasn't changed." "Good," he said. Then, "I heard the documentary is remarkable." "It's good work," I said. "We're proud of it." "You should be," he said simply. And that was the end of the conversation. I want to be clear that what happened in November was not something I sought or engineered. Awards in the culinary world are not typically sought. They arrive or they do not, and the best practitioners in any field spend more time on the work than on the relationship between the work and its recognition. I had always believed this, and I continued to believe it in November when the call came from the committee of the Prix de la Gastronomie Française, the most significant recognition given annually within the French culinary profession, informing me that Origine had been selected as the recipient of the Special Innovation Prize for its contribution to the evolution of the private dining format in France. The award ceremony was in December at a grand venue near the Palais Royal, attended by the French culinary world's most significant figures and a collection of food journalists, cultural critics, and public figures who occupied the overlap between the table and the broader conversation about French cultural life. It was a formal evening. Black tie long tables, the specific, magnificent combination of excellent wine and excellent company that the French culinary world knows how to produce when it turns its full attention to the task. Michelle accepted the award with me. We had agreed on this, the work was ours, together in the most complete sense of a professional partnership, and it would have been inaccurate for either of us to stand there alone. He spoke briefly. I spoke more briefly. I thanked Anaïs and the full Origine team and Maitre Dubois, whose name I mentioned specifically and whose presence in the audience I acknowledged with the directness that felt right. I thanked Michelle in the language that long professional relationships deserve, not effusively, but specifically the particular things rather than the general gratitude. And then I said one more thing, which I had not planned to say until I was standing at the microphone, and it became clear that it was the accurate thing to say. I said, "This award belongs partly to the 4 years I spent building this work without being seen. Those years were not wasted years. They were years in which I learned what I was building for and what I was building from. And the difference between those two things, the invisibility was not a loss. It was a condition. What you build in those conditions belongs entirely to you, which means that when it comes into the light, it comes without compromise. I am grateful for the recognition. I am more grateful for the work." I stepped back from the microphone. The room applauded. Somewhere in the third row, Anaïs was clapping with the enthusiastic lack of self-consciousness of someone who is 26 and does not yet know how to calibrate her visible emotions in formal rooms, which I found entirely wonderful. I looked out at the audience and I found at the far end of the third table, from the left, someone I had not known would be there. She was 73 years old, compact and fierce, with the permanent slight flower mark on her left sleeve that she had carried for 50 years and which I had come to believe was intentional. Chef Morvan, my first mentor, who had trained me for 6 years in the kitchen of Ardoise and who had told me once in the particular way of the best teachers that I had the palate of someone who understood that cooking was an argument and that every plate was a position. She raised her wine glass very slightly in my direction. She did not smile. It was better than a smile. It was the specific acknowledgement of a craftsperson who has watched someone they trained become the thing they trained them to be. I nodded back. Then I went to find Sophie, who had been permitted to attend the ceremony as a special occasion and who was sitting at the far end of our table in her best dress, eating the petit fours, with the focused concentration of someone conducting a professional evaluation. "How are they?" I asked, sitting beside her. "The salted caramel is excellent," she said. "The raspberry one is good, but the raspberry flavor is a bit thin. I think it needs more time in the reduction." She looked at me. "You can tell me later if I'm right." "I'll tell you now," I said. "You're right." She nodded, satisfied, and reached for another petit four. "The speech was good, Maman," she said without looking up. "The last part especially." "Thank you," I said. "The invisible part," she added. I thought that was accurate. I will tell you about Etienne because the complete story requires it, and because I have tried throughout this account to give the complete story rather than the comfortable one. In the months following the ruling, Etienne canceled one scheduled visit, one in the 6 months between March and September. He called me the evening before to tell me himself, not through his assistant, and he told me the reason directly, which was a genuine conflict with an unavoidable professional obligation, and he asked whether we could arrange a compensating visit the following weekend. We did. Sophie went to his apartment, a new one smaller than the family apartment they had shared without Isabelle, who had apparently concluded around the time of the ruling that the Beaumont situation was more complicated than it had appeared from the outside. And she came home on Sunday evening and told me they had gone to the Jardin des Plantes, and that Etienne had bought her a book about botanical illustration, and they had eaten at a Vietnamese restaurant he had never been to before, and tried 3 different things and argued about which was best. "Who won the argument?" I asked. "I did," Sophie said, "because I was right. The banh mi was obviously the best." "Obviously," I agreed. It was not a transformation. I do not believe in transformations in the sense of people becoming categorically different from what they are. I believe in adjustments and the gradual reordering of priorities that happens when the consequences of their current arrangement become undeniable. Etienne had been shown in the formal language of a federal ruling and the informal language of his 9-year-old daughter's handwritten letter what his current arrangement had cost and what it had produced. He was adjusting. The adjustment was real. Whether it would hold over years and under future pressures was a question that belonged to the future, and I held it there with appropriate caution and appropriate openness. What I knew, which was different. Sophie was all right. Sophie was by every measure available to me. Her school performance, her sleep, her appetite, the quality of her laughter, the increasing complexity and confidence of the opinions she expressed about food and music, and the correct technique for brushing a cat, which was a thing she had begun lobbying for with sustained and impressive persistence. Sophie was genuinely, substantially all right. This was the metric that mattered. Everything else was context. I want to end where I always end, which is in the kitchen. Not metaphorically, I want to tell you about a specific Saturday afternoon in late November, 3 weeks before the award ceremony, which I remember with the particular clarity of moments that do not announce themselves as significant but reveal themselves as such in retrospect. Sophie and I were making pastry together in the kitchen of the Murray apartment. She had decided with the characteristic combination of ambition and stubbornness that I was increasingly convinced was her most defining characteristic that she wanted to learn proper pâte feuilletée. Laminated pastry. The real kind, the long, complicated kind that requires hours and cold butter and the specific patience of someone who understands that the outcome depends on doing the same thing many times in sequence without losing focus. It is not a beginner's project. It was exactly the kind of project Sophie would choose. We had begun after lunch. It was 4 p.m, and we were on the 4th fold. The détrempe chilled and rested the barrage properly, worked the layers beginning their patient accumulation, and Sophie was working the dough with her small hands, following the motion I had shown her with the focused concentration she brought to the piano and to homework and to argument she intended to win. "Is this right?" she asked, not looking up. "Almost," I said, "a little more even on the right side. Feel the difference in resistance." She adjusted. I watched her hands find the right pressure without telling her, felt her way to it, which was the only way to actually learn it. "Better," I said. "Madame Girard says piano is about listening to what you're doing," Sophie said, still not looking up. "Not just doing it." "Cooking is the same," I said. "Is everything the same?" "The things worth doing," I said. "They tend to share a logic." She was quiet for a moment working. Then, "Maman, are you happy?" I looked at my daughter, at her flour-dusted hands and the small frown of concentration she made when she was working on something difficult, and the pale November light coming through the kitchen window, and the view of the Murray rooftops beyond it, and the warm smell of the kitchen, which was as it had always been. The smell of the place where I was most completely myself. "Yes," I said. "I am." "Good," she said with the decisive finality of a 9-year-old who has asked an important question and received a satisfactory answer. "Because this pastry is going to be excellent, and you should be in a good mood when we eat it." "I will be," I promised. She went back to the fold. I stood beside her watching her hands, and I thought about the 4 years of deliberate invisibility and the morning in the Palais de Justice and the recording on Frederick's phone, and the letter Sophie had read from her own handwriting in that silent courtroom, and the award and the documentary and the kitchen in the Murray at 4 p.m. with November light and laminated pastry, and my daughter who was teaching herself patience with cold butter and her own careful hands. I thought about all of it, and then I picked up the rolling pin and showed her the next fold, and we worked until the light changed and the pastry was ready, and then we made dinner together in the kitchen. That was ours, in the home. That was ours in the life that was ours, and it was sufficient and complete and entirely real. People sometimes ask me, colleagues, the occasional journalist, since the documentary once, a young chef who worked a stage in our kitchen for a month and stayed an extra week because she said she had never seen someone cook with that specific quality of conviction. They ask me what the past 4 years taught me, what I learned, what I would say to someone in a similar situation. I tell them this: build the thing that is actually yours. Not the version of it that fits other people's picture of what you should be doing or what your circumstances permit or what the people who want to diminish you have decided is available to you. The actual thing. With the actual skills you actually have. In the actual direction your actual intelligence actually points. Keep meticulous records, not out of paranoia, out of respect for the truth. The truth exists in documentation. It exists in the contact journal with 147 entries. It exists in the certified tax declarations of a 4 million euro company. It exists in a 9-year-old girl's handwritten letter folded carefully and kept in her school coat pocket until the moment came to unfold it in a room where it would matter. Keep the records. They are how the truth speaks when you cannot afford to speak it yourself. The silence is not the defeat. In the period when I was invisible, the Beaumont family interpreted my silence as evidence of my diminishment. They were wrong. The silence was the kitchen. It was where the work was happening out of sight, producing something that would only be served when the moment was correct. Silence is not the same as absence. It is often the condition under which the most significant preparation occurs. And this, which I return to, most often the people who try to reduce you to a size they can manage are always working from an incomplete picture. They see what they have decided to see. They document what serves their argument. They commission reports that confirm their conclusions. This is not stupidity, it is the specific, universal, and very human tendency to construct the reality that supports the story you have already written. The defense against it is not argument, it is evidence. It is the existence of a thing so thoroughly and honestly documented that the incomplete picture cannot survive its encounter with the complete one. I am Elena Vasquez, 36 years old, founding partner of Origine, winner of the Prix de la Gastronomie Française Special Innovation Prize, subject of a 6-episode documentary series that has been acquired by 2 additional European broadcasters since its French premiere, mother of a 9-year-old girl who makes accurate observations about raspberry reduction and who is learning laminated pastry with the patience of someone who has understood at 9 years old that the best things take the time they take. I have a kitchen in the Marais. I have a daughter who named her room after a lemon. I have a mentor who showed up in a courtroom without being asked because some things do not require asking. I have a lawyer who wins without theater and a pastry specialist who knows when the bergamot is a half measure too much. I have the rooftops of Paris outside my window every morning at 5:15 and the city below them, which belongs to everyone who is willing to build something real in it. I was made invisible for a time by people with significant resources and the specific certainty of those who have never been seriously opposed. They forgot what silence can contain. They forgot what a woman with a kitchen and 4 years and absolute clarity of purpose can produce in the dark. I did not forget. I cooked.